Chiefs of Staff of the Military Services. The theme of today's forum is Gathering Strength, how we muster sources of American strength to navigate the security challenges facing our country. Our military forces are a source of American strength, but our military advantage is not guaranteed. The panel will discuss what it takes to maintain that advantage and to prepare for this different security environment that we are facing. So I'm pleased to hand off to Seth to discuss these issues with the Vice Chiefs. Seth.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and thanks to all the team that put this Global Security Forum together. Where we sit, for those of you who are just joining us, is we started off looking at broad strategic questions. We'll move from this to the intelligence picture from the Director of National Intelligence to the thoughts of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and we'll move in the afternoon to the Defense Industrial Base and then emerging technologies. The theme of the Global Security Forum really does pick up on Winston Churchill's The Gathering Storm. As Carrie mentioned earlier, his book, The Gathering Storm, which came out in 1948, looked at the geopolitical changes. I'm actually in the middle of reading Andrew Roberts' nearly 1,000-page biography of Churchill, and it also feels a little bit like the Churchill position in the 1930s, where he is looking at German rearmament and pushing the UK to take the threat seriously, of which much of the leadership in the House of Commons and within 10 Downing Street does not take the threat seriously, which puts the British in a very difficult position as the Germans start to move on Poland and other countries. I'd like to start with General Mingus first, then go to General Mahoney, and then open it up to anybody else here who wants to weigh in. I want to start with sort of the current wars both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. The focus of our panel, thanks to all of you for joining, is on the future of warfare. But part of the question really is, what are you seeing, General Mingus, as you look at Ukraine, which is now in its third year? There's been some interesting innovation. I was over there a few weeks ago to talk to senior Ukrainian forces about innovation, but there's a lot there. We would certainly fight differently. In many ways, we have different capabilities, but precision strike, logistics, integrated air and missile defense, electronic warfare. And then when we move over to the Middle East, the active war in Gaza, the fighting we've seen, the back and forth along the Lebanese-Israel border, the Red Sea dimension, obviously the Iranian strikes against Israel and the Israeli response. So as you look at this picture and where we are and where we've come from following the Russian invasion, what are you seeing in terms of some of the primary lessons from the current wars, and how are you looking at adapting and evolving the Army based on those?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Seth. I guess I would start with 2014 instead of 2022, because 2014, a lot of people forget that that's when this really started. And we've had teams embedded over in Europe and in Ukraine since the original incursion in 2014. It's obviously taken it's gone to a whole different level after 2022. We continue to pull all those things. We embed those in our combat training centers. But I'll go back to where I started in the gap analysis that we did 2015, 2016 timeframe. Our adversaries have been watching us for a long time. And what they have, I think, come to the conclusion is they don't want to get into a close fight with the United States of America. And so they've developed a series of preclusionary tactics. Many call it A2AD or anti-access aerial denial, where they want to be able to sense further, shoot further, see us further, disrupt us further, so they don't ever have to experience that close fight component. The proliferation of technology as it's come on, the fact that you can't hide anywhere, air, land, sea, space. I mean, everything is ubiquitous in terms of where things are going, and so we're trying to learn from that. Where we're trying to go inside the Army is to have the ability to counter that. So it really boils down to command and control, our long-range precision fires. How do we keep pace with technology when it comes to unmanned systems? How do we pull all that together in a way that's coherent in the way that we're going to fight today and in the future? Working with all the services that are here today, I think a lot of those lessons learned are universal. But at the end of the day, we've got to be able to match the adversary when it comes to long-range precision fires, contested logistics, and command and control.
So one item, if I can just do a follow-up there, one item that the Joint Warfighting Concept 3.0 highlights is the challenge in this environment of maneuver. Yeah. So how are you thinking about maneuver in this environment?
So the cornerstone behind the Joint Warfighting Concept 3.0 is the term expanded maneuver. I like to view it as we have expanded the definition of maneuver. Maneuver in its classic sense is geographical. It's movement and fires. So you move to be able to place better fires on the adversary, and you place fires on the enemy so you can move. And those things are inextricably linked. But you can also move in cyberspace. You can move in space. You can have effects in space. You can have effects in cyber. You can have effects in air. And so the classic definition of maneuver, as we have all, which is one of the 9 principles of war, has expanded, and we've got to embrace that.
Thanks. General Mahoney, I wonder if we can come to you next, and then I'm going to actually move to the Red Sea after that, and then open it up to anybody else who wants to comment.
Sure, maybe just a couple of fill-ins on a pretty great response by my fighting mate over there. I think the first thing is, if you're facing a competent or much less a near-peer adversary, the idea of short and sharp conflict is probably a thing of the past. If we look specifically at Ukraine, 2 years plus on, that has been the definition of not short and sharp. And when we go to this Red Sea, we can talk about our counter moves against the Houthis, which they're very difficult to uproot, and that is continuing now. So retraction in time, I think, is a foregone conclusion, and that connotes the requirement to remove, reset, repair, and then reintegrate into the fight. It also connotes depth of magazine. which we see right at the forefront in Ukraine with our national security supplemental that was just passed. So if we think that is going to be delimited in time due to our choosing, we may want to think again about that. The second was brought up, and maybe just a different perspective on it, and that's observation. You will be seen. You will be seen in the visual spectrum. You'll be seen in the IR spectrum. You'll be seen in the EM spectrum. So you have to then integrate the ability to either camouflage, deceive, maneuver in order to make that observation less consequential. And we're seeing that in spades in the Ukraine-Russia example. Maybe specific to Marine Corps capabilities in the Black Sea and certainly in the Red Sea, but I'll keep it contained to the Black Sea until we move on, is this idea of landward littorals impacting the seaward maneuver space. Small, distributed units with the ability to sense and fire have sunk at least 13, 14, 15 Russian ships. You know, Nelson said a ship's a fool to fight a fort, and when they did, they figured out that maxim, although old, is probably still pretty true. Then you can go to Mahan, who said, without protection from the littorals, without protection from the landward side, you have a fortress fleet, where the fleet cannot sortie much beyond its protection from the land. And we've seen that happen in the Black Sea as the Russians have retrenched to the eastern portion, enabled a grain corridor to open up and enabled more freedom of movement by the Ukrainians. So small, maneuverable, distributed units that have long-range precision fires from the landward littorals to the sea is what is a big lesson for us.
So one follow-up, if I can, is one of the challenges, both with the Russians and the Ukrainians, as the war has been protracted, is their industrial bases and ensuring that forces on the ground have sufficient artillery, fire, air defense capabilities. So how do you think, as we look towards the possibility of protracted conflict, how are you thinking about whether it's stockpiles or just the broader industrial base and some of the challenges that we have? How does that impact how the Marine Corps is thinking about this?
Well, I think on the far back side, you need to have an industrial base that can either produce at scale right now or ramp up very quickly to build that depth of magazine. On our side, we have to have the ability to source those weapons at the time and place of our choosing. So you marry those up, and you need a different relationship right now, I think, between the operating forces as it goes back through to the defense industrial base. And I think you just wrote a piece on empty bins about the time frame through TTXs and war games, where we would go through some of our preferred munitions in a matter of days, if not weeks. There has to be an appreciation for that on the military side, and there has to be an appreciation for that on the defense industrial base side.
Can I just throw a red flag for pandering to the moderator? I think.
Oh, I'm not done, Jim. That's nothing. I'm just starting.
This is already. I've lost control of the panel right now.
I want to just make a comment, Seth, though, and then I'll go to the Red Sea piece. But I won't quote Mahan, but I will quote Steve Lazuski from 2020 when we did a panel about force design from the Marine Corps. Like, hey, what's this all about? And he said something, Mo, about flipping the script. Like, we tend to think of Marines going in one direction from sea to shore, and this flips that script. And what's happening in the Black Sea is evidence to that effect that we should look towards and think about, and you are doing that, and we should do that. From a Red Sea perspective, it takes a joint force for this big fight we're preparing for. Everybody brings something to that game. The Navy brings a mobility aspect with the Marine Corps when we don't have basing rights that are helpful, and we didn't at the beginning of this conflict. What we found, though, is we had to adapt. Every day we had to adapt. The adversary was going to adapt. They were going to change their tactics. They were going to watch us. We should assume that's going to happen, and we need to get better. What we had to do from a technology perspective is really tighten up the data reduction and introspection of, did the system perform as we thought it would? If it didn't, what can we do about that? Did the humans perform as we thought they would? If they didn't, what can we do about that? And provide that lesson to the fleet. So to me, there's a very quick learning cycle here that can be applied, now aided by technology, to take the data reduction and send it to shore and really look and see what the system did. So I think that's to our benefit, and we should use it for every ounce we can provide.
One issue I think that has come out of the Red Sea, and I'm curious how you're thinking about it, is we're certainly trading off when we shoot down drones or cruise missiles, some pretty expensive systems for, particularly in some of the drones, the UASs, some pretty cheap ones. So how are you thinking about, as you look towards the future, ways to, for counter UAS, for example, that's a slightly better trade-off on cost?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely an emphasis and a re-emphasis on counter UAS. Army's led that for a long time. Navy's focused on it from both a shore perspective and a ship perspective. And we need to do more work there because we are at the wrong end of the cost curve. But when people lure me into that discussion, Seth, I push back and say the crew of a DDG is worth more than that. So where we are now, we need to keep, we have a shot, we should take the shot. Yeah. And we put those commanding officers in a very tight box where they've got about 10 to 15 seconds to make the decision. So let's encumber that. And you put your system in a position, and your ship in a position where you can maximize the effect of that and do that. And then let's go reflect on this and figure out a better way to do this, maybe through some directed energy, electronic warfare, high-powered microwave things in the future. And I think we're looking at that. And we appreciate the quickness of our system to look at the ability for some of our electronic systems libraries to update them. And that's increased at pace in the Red Sea. So the intelligence community has played in this and reached the same kind of parity as us with our combat systems. And I think we just got to keep doing that.
If I could add a couple things on counter-UAS. So counter-UAS, clearly a thing today, and it's an acute threat that we're putting a lot of time, energy, and resources to try to figure out how to counter that. But in the longer term, it has to be viewed through the lens of the broader integrated air and missile defense architecture, because it is defending from the air. And in that context, the way all the services have looked at that particular problem set is we defend points on the ground, or a spot on the ground, or a critical asset, or something fixed. That's generally how we do that. We've got to change that approach and look at it more like we would in a typical defensive posture, where you establish engagement areas, and you have layer defense, you have things that can disrupt and break, and then you have that last line of defense that comes in, and the cost point, absolutely. But we're the same way when you look at the engagements that are happening. A Coyote missile is relatively expensive, but I would never question an operator, do I shoot at 20 kilometers, or I wait until that thing's 1 or 2 kilometers out? So you're never going to sacrifice that decision making at the tactical level.
That's one thing. The flexibility of the joint force to readapt and provide additional layers of defensive depth shouldn't be lost on it. Aircraft now shooting down cruise missiles from the Air Force and the Navy and the Marine Corps. So to me, that's another thing to do exactly what Jim said. Let's not put ourselves in a box standing here with one resort.
This Jim, by the way, right? Okay.
There's a couple of us.
There are a few Jims here, which is going to get confusing.
We like to sit together to confuse people.
I wanted to open up to see if there were any other, on this issue, current fight, any other comments?
Yeah, what I would offer, first, thanks, and having read your really excellent books, I frankly, should have been a Pulitzer Prize winner, in my opinion.
You're just trying to get softball questions, I know that.
The best way to deter is to be prepared to fight and be perceived as being prepared to fight. And so as we think about kind of the strategic environment we're in many ways, these are the interwar years. You started off talking about the Gathering Storm. So what was going on during the Gathering Storm, right? The Spanish Civil War. There was a lot of lessons to be learned in the Spanish Civil War. You wonder whether things like Ukraine and what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in the Red Sea, is this the Spanish Civil War of our era? Then, shame on us if we don't learn the lessons that we need to learn in order to more effectively deter, so we don't have the storm that may be gathering. And so when you look at kind of lessons that we ought to be learning right now, I think for the Air Force, for a long, long time, we boastfully said no American has been killed by air attack since 1953. We can't say that anymore. And we can't say that anymore because our traditional conception of what things like air superiority means have changed. Quadcopters with a hand grenade can kill an American just as easily as a MiG or a Sioux can. And so as we think about what does air superiority mean in an era of proliferated small UAS and one-way attack drones and so forth, I think there's some lessons to be learned. And we're soaking that up right now. The other thing that you might think about, General Mingus talked about movement and firepower. And, I think one thing that you can look at in Ukraine is, it is the return of firepower. And the reason that it has become so bloody is because of the lack of ability to maneuver. One component of that is the inability of both sides to achieve air superiority in the face of a proliferated air threat and formidable air defenses. And so I think there are some lessons that we can be learning, and frankly, we are. You asked about the exchange ratio. Our coalition forces had a pretty successful weekend a couple of weekends ago against a really concerted Iranian attack on Israel. And so you asked about exchange ratios. Some of what was shot down with bullets. I mean, it was 20-millimeter shells coming out of the front end of a fighter. That's a pretty favorable cost exchange right there. Now, I don't know that that's scalable, but we were thinking about, as General Mingus talked about, this layered defense, and I think it really showed the value of our work here several weeks ago.
If I could just ask one follow-up, because you mentioned air superiority, and one of the challenges, I think, in areas like the Pacific is in and around bases, for example. So how are you thinking about air superiority in the construct of base defense, including air defense? I realize this pulls in the Army, at least the Army, into this response as well. So how are you thinking about the jointness that's necessary? So I'm thinking like Guam, for example.
Yeah, so Guam is a particular case study, but it's a broader question than that. And, one of the comparative advantages that I think the U.S. enjoys, and there are a host of them, capital markets is a comparative advantage. Innovation in the commercial marketplace is an advantage. Empowered NCOs and petty officers across the joint force are a comparative advantage. Another one of our comparative advantages, frankly, is our ability to operate jointly. And so I can tell you that on the topic of air-based air defense specifically, there is not a closer relationship than that, specifically between the Army and the Air Force inside the department right now, of jointly attacking this problem, looking at the analysis of what are the most effective ways to contribute to air-based air defense. And I'm really encouraged by, kind of us leveraging one of our comparative advantages, which is our ability to work jointly.
Anything from either of you on current wars? We'll come back with lots of other questions. But
no, to build on what Jim just talked about our comparative advantage to operate joint. We are seeing that more than we've ever seen before, and I think it's something that our near-peer adversaries counted out against us. They didn't think we would be able to fight joint. They also didn't think we'd be able to fight with our allies. They also didn't think we were going to be able to fight with our commercial partners. So what we are learning from not only what's going on in the Middle East, but especially in Ukraine, is that we're bringing all of this to bear simultaneously on the adversary, but the adversary is also bringing similar to bear against us. So it really is going to require us to be much more integrated and networked going forward, and that's really where we're starting to spend a lot of our energy.
There's one other piece I'd like to add, which is a little more pedestrian here, but in our roles as vices, we find ourselves in similar forums. One of those is the JROC, where we meet and discuss problems at a joint level. We also go to the DMAC, which is a similar forum to do that. I think initial days here for us in this group of vices, but acknowledging the reliance on each other from a program perspective. Like, I need some stuff that the Space Force is going to give me if I'm going to close those long-range fires that Jim talked about, or the Air Force. So that understanding requires you to be a little less parochial and a little bit more thoughtful. And so, this JADC2 effort, which has been going on for quite some time, is an imperative. How we get there is what we really need to focus on so we collectively can benefit from each other.
Micro example of a success story that we jointly share with the Marine Corps, and I'm sure the other services have them, but going back to your questions about industrial base and lessons learned, but pre-conflict, this is 155 artillery, which is one of the principal things we've been providing to Ukraine in this current conflict, and they've expended in excess of 2 million rounds of 155. Prior to February 2022, we were collectively producing between us and the Marine Corps about 14,000 rounds a month. We quickly moved that to 18, then to 24, then to 28. This month we'll produce 30. By the end of this year, we'll be at 50 and 72, and then with the supplemental that just was thankfully passed last night, we'll be at 100,000 rounds by next summer. So huge success story in terms of how working with our industrial partners, we have ramped up to a level that is going to be commensurate with the need.
Yeah. You going to jump in as well?
Yeah, I was just going to offer that we're very proud of our status as a fighting force as well, and as part of the joint force. You may be surprised to know that the United States Coast Guard is present in every single continent and embedded in every single combatant command. There's probably no greater representation of that than the 6 Coast Guard cutters and the Advanced Interdiction Team and our training teams that we have operating in the 5th Fleet in the Arabian Gulf. But for us, it's an away game. How do we fight forward? But it's also how do we ensure resiliency domestically? And so I think that's another component that we have to look at. What are we doing domestically to ensure America's resiliency if there is a conflict? For us, it's maritime resiliency, it's port infrastructure. It's how do we protect port infrastructure from threats, both malign state actors and non-state actors. So I just wanted to put that on the table because I think it's an important component when we talk about war fighting and conflict, that we not lose sight of the fact that there is going to be a huge domestic component to it. And that domestic component will involve, yes, the military services, NORTHCOM, leveraging Coast Guard responsibilities in the maritime,